Start a conversation. It's easier than you know. Start a conversation. Nobody should feel alone.
Welcome to Super Connected Conversations. I'm Tim Arnold, and I'm thrilled to introduce you to a guest who has been transforming the way we think about children's speech and language development for over 3 decades. Sandy Chappell is a paediatric speech and language therapist with extensive experience in both the NHS and private practice. Her work has impacted countless families, helping children with speech and language disorders. Sandy is dedicated to raising awareness about the impact of screens on communication skills and is involved in initiatives that train parents, teachers and early years staff. She's also the author of the fantastic book How to Raise a Chatterbox, which is a practical guide to lots of screen-free activities. And this is where Sandy and I really see eye to eye, and why I wanted to talk to her, because she's an expert on all the things that I kind of guess my way through with Super Connected. Sandy's advocacy for reducing screen time led her to join the new campaign group Health Professionals for Safer Screens. It's a real privilege to speak to her today. Hello, Sandy. Hi, how are you?
Hi, I'm really good, Tim. So nice to see you again.
And nice to see you. Not as nice as the last time because it was in
True.
real space, but we've done it
Yeah,
the right way round, haven't we?
yes, definitely.
It's so much better than it was in the pandemic when you would meet people like this and then eventually see them in real life. I'm making a point of doing it the right way round these days.
Perfect.
Thank you so much for agreeing to come and do this. And you know, I'm fascinated in your lens because 30 years, I think, working with language, speech and little people, children,
Yeah,
and how they're communicating and what it is in their environment that facilitates or hinders their ability to communicate. To me, with the advent of, why we're talking about this, smartphones, what's dangerous, what's acceptable, and everything in between, there's been an intuitive process for me working it out as a songwriter, and I'm
yeah,
fascinated to hear from an expert what it's like spending that much time understanding this. You really are an expert. Can we just start with where you feel that the 30 years has brought you to? Because I think your perception of this situation is so valuable. I'd love to hear how's it changed? What does that look like?
yeah. Well, when I started work, of course, there were no screens like there are now. There was just TV. And my focus then, when I'd go into a home to work with young children, was to encourage parents to use as little TV as possible. And very often the TV would always be on in the background, and parents would think that that wouldn't have an impact, particularly if it was a program the child wasn't interested in. But it did. Even background noise like that from a TV impacts on how much a child will speak while they're playing and how much the parent will speak to the child because they're constantly distracted by this thing in the corner of the room. And that has just exploded now that we can have a screen in our hands the whole time.
Mhm.
So
I
the
guess you look
average,
back at those times and sort of grateful when televisions were stuck in the corner of a room and just sort of.
absolutely, yeah. Oh, I could never have imagined that there would be a screen that followed a child in a pushchair or in a car, you know. That would have sounded horrific to me. And it is. It is horrific. Um, and I think my problem is for parents that they don't understand how horrific it is, and they're led to believe that they're doing the right thing because the tech companies, the app developers are promoting these things as being educational,
Mm.
and most of them just aren't, and they're taking away from children's learning.
We're going to talk about tech companies, but
Yeah.
I thought we'd sort of go through a couple of different micro topics of this topic.
Okay.
Um, and take turns. I've got these 9 different topics, and I started doing this on this podcast a little while ago because for the precise reason that we're here, that we're all living in a world where so many of us have got short attention spans, and it's the same with podcasts and YouTube videos where if you give somebody an hour or an hour and a half, they go like, whoa. But if there's little chapters
Yeah.
that you can choose from, it's a little bit less daunting. So the first one I'm going to choose, you've got the list, I've given it to you as well, so you can choose the
I
next
have.
one. But the first one I want to choose is the word bond.
Yeah.
And I'm sure you know why I've chosen that word. But this actually comes from something that happened an hour and a half ago, which you don't know about. And I
Right.
swim pretty much every day. So I'm at the nearest gym to where I live.
Uh,
And I always see they've got a swimming instructor there that teaches little kids, I think 5, 6, 7 years old. And they've always got their parents or one of their parents sitting outside and generally on their smartphone and not really watching their kids. And for sure, there's going to be good reasons. Sometimes it's work or some other issue. I'm not coming at this from a kind of judgmental perspective, but today, I was watching a small child who'd come out after his swimming lesson. This is as I'm getting out of the pool to come here actually, and the child's mother was on the phone, and I just turned round and then I took a last glance and they were having a hug. And within the space of, I don't know, well, let's say 30 seconds, I'd seen this child looking a little bit sort of like what's my mother doing as she was furiously tapping away on the phone as we do. And
yeah.
then within a few seconds, they were having a hug, and I just saw that how quickly these two opposite actions had happened, and it made me think about that bonding that happens with us all, with our mother or father or both, hopefully, when we're very, very little. And I just wondered if you talk about what you know about that period where we bond and how that might be affecting it, how smartphones might be affecting
Well, when babies are first born, they look for faces and they listen for voices. So they will try and pick out human voices amongst all the noise that they hear. And that is their preference. They want to listen to particularly their mother's voice or their father's voice that they will all already recognize. So they're listening for voices and they're looking for faces or anything that looks like a face. So they're born as social creatures, and that just blossoms as they grow and develop. And they will always prefer to listen to a familiar human voice, and they'll always prefer to see a familiar face than anything else. Which is why I always say to parents of young children, you are your child's favourite toy. Never mind all the battery operated things that flash and make all these noises. If they have a choice between that and you doing anything with them, they'll choose you.
it.
So that's where the bonding happens. And it happens every single time you play with your child because they sense that you're interested, they sense that you're listening. And I've seen what you've seen. I've seen children kind of shut down when they try and get parents' attention and the parent is on their phone. After a couple of attempts, the child will just shut down and give up. And you won't get that moment back. There was an opportunity for bonding. If the child had something really desperate that they wanted to say,
Mm.
and you haven't listened, and you can't always listen. There are other reasons why you might not be able to listen. But if you're
Yeah.
constantly on your phone, they'll soon learn that you're not interested and you'd rather be focused on this other thing in your hand. And that's so sad.
What would you say to parents who have those moments where they're caught between something that in their world is very important that they need to tend to on a mobile device and the attention of their child? If it's in, if it becomes two things vying for their attention, and one of them is perceived to be important.
Yeah.
Because what I do know about this is that making parents feeling guilty is, as I
Oh,
agree, it's like that's not going to help anyway. It's how where's the balance? How do they begin to find it in the moment? How do we remember that it might have an accumulative effect on a child if every day or every other day we're paying attention to something else that isn't them.
yeah. I mean, obviously, if it is really important, if you can take a brief moment to explain to the child, look, I really just have to do this. I'll only be a couple of minutes, and then I promise we'll play, or I promise we'll listen. I'll listen. And then do good on that promise, follow it through. But I think I never want parents to feel guilty, but I think it's also important that we tell parents the truth.
Yes.
Um, I know in my work, I do things very differently in therapy now than I did a few years ago because I've done extra training. And I think, well, I know better now, so I can do better.
Mm.
But we can't expect parents to do better if they don't know better, if we haven't given them the information.
Mm.
So we've got to be honest. Um, and
And
I would all,
when you say honest, you mean not sort of excusing the norms that are recent, I think. It's only really since 2010 that it's an absolute digital norm that we have a 24-hour connection to the internet because of a mobile device, isn't it? I mean, it's 14 years.
yeah, yeah. And we just have to be clear and explain what the harms are so that parents can then make an informed decision about what they do. If they're told, well, that's educational, this app's educational, and they think, well, I can put my child on that app knowing, I'll be happy that they're learning something while I get on with what I'm doing on my phone. Um, and if we're honest and say it probably isn't educational, and for under fives, screens do more harm than good.
Mm.
And then parents can make a choice and they've got all the information that they need.
It's interesting that there's so many different opinions on this because of course it's different age groups,
Yes.
it's different classes even, I mean
Yeah.
I don't think anyone's immune, are they, from anyone under the age of 16 is not immune to some form of dependency. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's starting younger and younger. You know, Babies and toddlers are addicted to screens. And behavior's becoming worse when parents then try to take the screens away. Um,
I won't
Whereas,
be too provocative, but and I think anybody that knows my album and film with Super Connected will know why I'm asking this question. But I want to ask you because you you know so much more about it than I do. What's your opinion, um, and or reaction rather to companies like Apple that have their kind of crash in the Apple Store where parents and their toddlers are there with trying out iPads and iPhones and seeing themselves on screens. What to somebody that's in your work, what does that feel like?
Dreadful. Yeah, I think at that sort of age where a child needs a creche, we should be keeping them as far away from screens as possible. We know that the under twos learn nothing at all from screens because of their poor attention. That's been shown in lots and lots of research. So we advise, as our health professionals group, we're advising no time other than FaceTiming family or friends,
Mm.
none for under twos. Um, so creches where there are loads of toys and parents are playing with their children, or there's someone else playing with their children to give parents a chance to do their own thing, that's fine. But we shouldn't be encouraging the under fives.
And you subscribe to the Jonathan Haidt's concept that we need to sort of reverse the phone-based childhood back to a play-based childhood.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, a typical day in the life of a 3-year-old now is nothing like it was a few years ago before COVID, even. Because, of course, lockdowns kick-started a dependency on screens to entertain, to pacify, and to educate children. And that's never gone away.
Mm.
It's just gathered pace.
Just going back to the word that we started with, bond, and the bond between
Yes.
a
Yeah.
child and its parent. Um, you said that a child doesn't learn anything through screens under I think under the age of 5. Is that what you said?
But under two, they don't learn anything and they
Uh,
learn little under five.
yeah. But would they learn the habit, or um, does it sit in somebody's undeveloped mind who's that young that it's normal to have screens all the time if they see it? I'm interested about that, how much is seeing a parent or an older sibling constantly on screens if you're 2 years old. Does that have an impact or not? Should we not worry about that?
Well, it's research shows that children's screen habits are very much reflected in the screen habits of other family members. So what they see, they become. So they do think it's a norm to spend a lot of the time in front of a screen. And families that where parents spend less time, children naturally do too.
Mm. And I suppose that has an effect on the bond, because if you get to a certain age where you have access to a phone yourself, you're no long non sort of looking towards a parent, and working with that bond that starts immediately, I guess, isn't it? As soon as you're born.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are critical times during the day where I think we all bond. So meal times, that's a great time to get together and discuss our day. And so many children now eat their meals in front of a screen.
Mm.
And bedtime, the bedtime story is really dying out and
Mm.
it's being replaced with screens. And that's such a fabulous time to bond with your child, snuggled up, reading a book.
It cultivates your own imagination,
Yeah.
and to sort of uh, start using those muscles, the muscles that make the pictures in our head, rather than digesting or consuming the pictures around us. Um, has there been a research on that yet, in terms of, I mean, this is something that I covered on the song, Start with the Sound, the effects of the bombardment of imagery and digital imagery in particular. I mean, anything that's been created to be put on the screen rather than, sitting a baby in front of a lake. That's a different kind of image. Is there a research that shows the effects of those two different sort of natural imagery and that power, versus the power of the imagery that we see on screens?
a lot of the screen time that's aimed at children is very fast-paced, very bright,
Mm.
and toddlers just can't cope with that. And it does affect their behavior. So watching a screen before bedtime is such a bad idea because it really wakes them up, and it's the last thing you want when your child's meant to be going to sleep.
Mm.
Um, so yeah, there is a lot of research to show the impact on that. Whereas with a book, the parent can go at whatever pace they want. They can go at the child's pace, and they can go back to a previous page if the child wants to do that. But if they're just listening to a story on a screen, it's going to go at the pace that it's going to go at. The parent has no control over that.
Mm. Yes, the speed and the pace of well, digital life in general. I mean, for adults, I think
Yeah.
it's challenging as it is. Certainly for me as well it is. But uh, I feel like I've milked this first word about bonding, and I know that we're going to come back to it a lot because the core of all of this is about how we make sure parents and children are closer to each other than tech companies and children, which is what is happening in some quarters.
Yeah.
But why don't you choose a word, one of these words that I've sent, and
Okay. I guess interact, which is the next one, that is just crucial, and it's something that children don't get from screens. So as we're talking, we're kind of watching each other's facial expressions and looking for, well, are they a bit confused? Do I need to explain that again or say it slightly differently? A screen can't do that. They
Mm,
can't see the child and react to that. Um, and learning language is very much two-way. It's serve and return, back and forth.
mm,
And
mm.
that just doesn't happen with screens. And it's so crucial for language.
It's interesting the word interact, which is obviously it is acting as in action, isn't it? It's to do with an action, but it's bringing two things together, and it's used hugely by a lot of the corporations responsible for creating the apps and the
Yeah.
devices. We don't need to name them all; everyone knows them. But yeah, how you interact with this intuitive uh, app, or how you interact with the digital world, or how you interact. This has become so normal, but like a lot of it, a lot of the digital revolution, age appropriate activities were just not discussed very much.
No.
It's that this is part of what's happening now, of course. Um, but in terms of when I wrote the word down, interact, I was of course thinking about parents and children and
Yeah.
how they're interacting.
Yep.
And I'm not a parent, but I have co-parented a little bit since the lockdown with my partner's kids, and it's really complicated with interaction that isn't somehow involving tech in some way now, isn't it?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And we might interact with our phones, and children might do that. But do they interact back? I would say not. So it's still a one-way thing. We children will press things and swipe, but they don't give a proper response back to the child,
Mm.
which is what they want.
You're working with children and parents all the time. Out of the two groups, children or parents, who comes to you with the concerns around smartphones the most?
Um,
obviously it's harder for a child to express that, but that you can identify that there's something that's not sitting well with either group. Is it, do you hear a lot from kids or do you hear more from parents? Is it both?
Well, with children, what I found is that if you give them a choice, which I have done, I spent a whole term where I had an iPad in my bag, and at the end of the session, I'd say you can choose anything out of the toy bag, including the iPad, and anything you like. And they never chose the iPad. They
Wow.
always wanted to do a puzzle with me or read a story or play a game with me.
And what age?
Uh,
Ages, different age?
oh, that's from 3 to 8.
Wow. Yeah.
Not once, not one child chose the iPad.
Mm.
But the concerns are largely coming from nursery staff and teachers who have seen a huge difference in children's communication skills and see how children are arriving at nursery or school with a phone in their hand. And then as soon as they walk out of the door at the end of the day, they're given a phone or they get into the car and they've got their iPad.
Mm.
And they can see the impact year on year. They feel children's communication skills are getting worse.
It's funny when you're talking about that, of course, it reminds me of when you came to see the film and the scene with the grandmother with the iPad must have triggered
Yeah.
you
Oh,
immediately.
absolutely.
But when I wrote that, that I didn't think this was happening everywhere. In fact, that was a fictional part. The teenager that's addicted to screens and apps is true, and that's based on a true story. But I built the family as a kind of, to balance it all out based on my own problems with being addicted to smartphones and apps. But it's
Yeah.
true, isn't it? I think grandmothers are becoming really valuable for toddlers
Oh,
and children.
yeah. Well,
Grand,
those were the two people that really resonated with me, the toddler and the grandmother.
Mhm.
And for people who haven't seen the film, I won't give anything away, but towards the end, I really worried for this poor toddler. What's she going to do now? You
Yeah.
know? And you demonstrated with her that she didn't want to play on the screen. She was putting it on her head and, she
Mm.
didn't want to use it as a device, but you could see how easily she was going to be drawn in because of the rest of the family.
Pick another word, and and I am going in the order that I wrote these now.
Yeah, fine.
It's lockdown.
Yeah.
Because I've read some of the literature about your work in terms of how that period, certainly in the UK, changed things.
Yeah.
And the lockdown 2020, when that began, March, can you talk about what you were doing and actually how, when you realized that this was having a huge effect on communication skills with children?
It was clear as soon as lockdown was announced what would happen. And all speech and language therapists and anyone with any knowledge of child development could easily predict what would happen, simply because social interaction forms the foundation for all communication. That's how communication develops. And if you take that away, there's no way that the rest of it can develop. So we could all see that coming.
Mm.
Um, and I was just amazed that so few people were speaking out and talking about it. And those that did were ignored. And, the powers that be chose not to listen to those people. Um, but for me, my referrals gradually started to go up fairly soon after the first lockdown, and certainly after the second one. I'd gone from sort of one or two referrals a month, and there was one week where I got 15 referrals in a week.
Goodness.
That was the difference.
Yeah.
So then I was very concerned about the harm it was doing. It was even worse than I had imagined it would be.
We're used to hearing about um, all kinds of things that happened during the lockdowns that are now being investigated, or, a lot of people have got a lot to say about different areas of it. But this this part where young people are for the first time not able to go out, and certainly I'm aware of some of the music students that I've lectured who are, I don't know, at gig going age during the lockdowns.
Yeah.
There's a real stunting of growth in terms of, going out and being with your mates and music and all that kind of stuff. Um, but for those that are much younger, how quickly did ed tech sort of start to feel like, oh, this is going to be the norm, and this is, it felt kind of immediate.
Yeah, I think it was slowly increasing, but during lockdowns, it just exploded. And my hope and expectation was that after lockdowns, it would drop off again and
Mhm.
everyone would start going out and children would go on playing again and go to libraries and parks um, and it kind of never happened and we just kept relying on screens. Um, so yeah, we found that, children listen to less music now than they used to. They might hear music in a TV show, but just sitting and listening to music,
Mm.
that happens less often. Fewer children are learning musical instruments. Um, I asked at my local library and fewer children are going to the library. So I'd hoped that we might go back to some sort of normal, um, but we just haven't.
I often get excited and I see organizations that are springing up and talking about internet, digital rights, young people, safeguarding. And then suddenly in the middle of it, I quite often find that it's actually all centered around making sure kids have got access. It's a very strange thing because I often think, here's an organization that are trying to raise awareness about how unnormal this is for little human beings that are developing gradually, hopefully at their own pace. And then actually it's no, no, we've got towns or cities or entire countries that do not have access to computers and technology and the internet, and we must change. And I was a little bit shocked, actually. I was thinking, okay, so there's not even a discussion in some areas about whether this should be normal or not. And I know, and I've been involved in sort of blended learning, and I think that's a really good balanced approach to it. But it's complex, isn't it? Can you talk about it from, as being in the field that you're in, what it looks like, where you've got on one hand people are really championing that everyone should have access to the internet, everyone should have a smartphone, and then on the other side you're seeing huge problems and the impact on young people's communication skills because of that.
Yeah, well, when I've had discussions with people in EdTech and app developers, um, their argument is, well, the genie's out of the bottle now. So what we need to do is give everyone the same access to really good tech and good apps,
Mhm.
rather than try and restrict children's access to screens.
With the normalization of social media and smartphones, what is actually your fear? And I ask that because I can kind of hear in your voice that you have some fear for the future around this, don't you?
Well, yeah, I mean, particularly for younger children again, because A quarter of 3-year-olds have their own smartphone, have social media accounts. Um, so they're going on things like TikTok and YouTube and Instagram, and a lot of them are having unrestricted access
Mm.
at 3 years old. And that's, I don't want to step on Sanjeev's toes here, but that has an effect on the development of their brains. You know, you can see the structure of their brains is different
Mm.
from children who don't go on screens a great deal.
Mm.
So it's incredibly worrying.
Um, do you want to pick another word?
Remote consultations.
I mean, this really fascinated me. So remote consultations for me were horrific anyway, and then I realized why when I was diagnosed with autism afterwards. It was like, okay, yeah, I really need that to see the eyes and the
Yep.
expression and everything, and I'm very lucky. My GP's incredible, and I get all that. And now I'm thinking about the lockdown and how that was normalized.
Yeah.
And how did was that? How did it work for children? Was it the
It,
same?
yeah, it was awful. It just didn't work for me at all. I mean, for younger children, 2 and 3-year-olds, there's no way that you can keep them sitting and listening
Mm.
for half an hour, 45 minutes. You just can't do it. Other children, older ones, where I was maybe working on their speech sounds, very often the connection would drop out or there'd be a delay. So I'd hear the sound or the word that they were saying, and then a few seconds later their mouth would move. You
Mm.
know, I couldn't work like that. So there were only a few weeks where we were told by our professional bodies that we really shouldn't be seeing children face to face. And
Mhm.
then I wasn't allowed to do that. But other than those few weeks, I carried on doing my visits and my clinics. And parents desperately wanted me to do that.
Mm. And did you notice during that time the convenience of being able to use Zoom and have a smartphone and being able to communicate in those ways? Did you hear that from a lot of people?
Yeah, a lot of people felt then it was a very positive thing. Um, and yeah, if there was nothing else, which for a few weeks for me there wasn't, I gave it a go. But I hated it. The children hated it. I had, you know, I work with children with communication disorders. They're, you know, they're going to need to see me, like you were just saying, they're going to need to give me eye contact, to pick up on my facial expressions, my body language. Um, and I had several children with stammers who hate technology anyway. You know, they don't like speaking on the phone, and they certainly don't like being on camera.
Mm.
So it really didn't work for them. So it was of no benefit to any of the children that I was working with.
And what were the NHS like as an organisation with that? Was it divided, or was it, are you in a minority or a majority?
Well, because I work independently now,
Yeah.
I could choose, for the most part, I could choose what I was doing. So, for example, I didn't wear a mask with the agreement of parents. If they were happy with that, I never wore a mask. Whereas NHS therapists were told they had to wear a mask during their sessions. Well, that had a huge impact on how effective their therapy was. You know, I spend a lot of my time with young children pointing at my mouth. I sit opposite them and
And
I
to
say,
be
"What?"
specific, these are sessions specifically for children with language learning difficulties.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, and seeing the whole face is so important for these children. They pick up on other cues, not just the words you're saying, because very often they don't understand them.
Mm.
Um, so yeah, it was just dreadful.
And how much of an effect did that period with the lockdowns have on the NHS that's sort of continued as the NHS is today?
I think it had a huge impact on morale in the NHS, um, including speech and language therapists. And I know several therapists who left. So there's now a quarter of speech and language therapy posts unfilled.
Wow.
You know, we've got huge waiting lists and
Mm.
less therapists than we've ever had. So that's a big problem. Therapists can't cope with the increasing numbers of children that have been coming to them because of lockdowns, because the impact that lockdowns have had. Um, and you know, if you're a newly qualified therapist and you come out into a job and you've got a huge caseload, you can't give children what they need because you just don't have the time. It's so demoralizing, you
Mm.
know?
Yes,
Um,
as a profession, it to me it sounds absolutely vital. Uh, I mean, even for children who don't have severe communication difficulties, I think for all children to be able to um, sort of enter into the world that you create, but you know that you've detailed in your book, how to become a chatterbox. I think it's massive for how society grows, isn't it?
Absolutely. I'm sure, I mean, lockdowns have had an impact on all children.
Mm.
You know, it's not just the unlucky few, it's all children.
Mm.
Because we reduce their experiences dramatically, and that's what children need to develop.
This brings me out to the experience blocker, which
Yeah.
is another Jonathan Haidt term. So just in case the listener or the viewer hasn't heard this idea, but that Jonathan Haidt refers to smartphones as experience blockers, so that you know rather than interfacing with real world and physical phenomenon and risk and fear and danger and the kind of primal instincts that we learn from when we're very little, they all become kind of null and void when you're you know centered on the screen all the time.
Yeah.
um, in your field, what can you sort of tell us any examples of where you've seen children having their experience of the living world blocked, like specifically by using screens?
Well, play. I mean, screens reduce children's opportunity to play, and play is how children learn about everything. You know, when you're teaching them the names of things, they want to pick the thing up and they feel it, and babies put it in their mouths to see what it tastes like and the texture. If you're getting that same thing as an image on a phone, they're not going to get that. They're not going to get that sensory feedback from the objects. Um, so play has just decreased significantly. Imaginative play and creative play and messy play, you know, and children spend far less time outside. So all those opportunities for play are getting shorter and shorter because children are spending longer and longer on their phones.
Mm. As someone that's working this much with kids, um, and on the well-being of kids, what is your general feeling towards the companies whose businesses depend on a lot of people, including kids, using their services?
It's actually difficult to blame the tech companies when we're allowing it to happen. If we didn't buy the technology, then they'd go out of business, wouldn't they? So the worry for me is, I go into schools and I think, where did all the money come from for all these iPads? Every child has their own iPad. When schools are saying, oh, we'd love to have you coming in for one session a week, but we haven't got the money. And then suddenly they have the money for all this technology. Um, I'm guessing some of it will be given for free, some of it will be at a reduced rate. Um, I don't think the evidence is there.
Mm.
So why are schools allowed to do that without evidence that it's improving learning? Because I can't believe that it is. So as a profession, I have to use evidence to demonstrate an improvement in children's learning. So why isn't the same true of schools?
Mm. Do you find that evidence is sometimes just sort of bypassed, on this topic?
Yeah, well, I don't think it's required. I don't think schools
Mm.
require it. And the Department for Education, I don't think they require it. It makes life easier for teachers sometimes. I can see that.
Mm.
Uh,
The
it just,
argument for technology in general is quite often there's one word that's bandied around from everything from apps to AI, and it's efficiency. Um, and certainly, if you're trying to get to work or you're trying to run a business, efficiency can be very important. It feels from what you're saying that this need for efficiency it's kind of trickled down into the area, and under the ages of 16, that efficiency isn't it's kind of a hallowed time in our lives, isn't it, where we don't need to be efficient childhood.
yeah, absolutely. Um,
And I think efficiency might be what some of the schools you're talking about is why they, sort of embraced ed tech and certainly devices and screen-based devices.
yeah, totally. And I can even see it right down at the younger age group in nurseries, where, for example, so many more children are coming to nursery and into reception who are not potty trained. So staff have to take that on board and spend time doing that. So having a screen there where there's nursery rhymes playing or story time on a screen is helpful for the staff because they're busy doing other things that they perhaps didn't need to do as much before lockdowns.
Mm.
Because children's development overall, not just speech and language, but their overall development has gone backwards. So
Mm.
nursery staff are spending time doing things that would be the remit for parents before lockdowns.
It sounds very stretched,
Oh,
but
yeah.
yeah. Um, and you know, sound is the one I've got a personal kind of thing about sound and how technology has changed sound and is still changing sound. And I know we talked about it a little bit when we met
Yeah.
um, the first time. How's that changed with youngsters in terms of, I don't mean music so much, but just listening and hearing and identifying sound as an energy in the world around you when you're small.
Yeah, well, one of the important things that children need to be able to do is to identify where different sounds come from and what's making those sounds. Um, well, if they're staring at a screen, all the sounds are coming from the screen. They don't have to listen closely enough to say, oh, is that daddy's car or mummy's car, or is it a car further down the street? They don't need to listen to those subtle differences if it's all in a screen. Speech is different through a screen. If we were together in the same room, we would sound different to each other than we sound through a screen. Um, yeah, and similar sounds and words might be more difficult for children to perceive through a screen than they are if they were hearing those with a person next to them.
One of the things that's been a bugbear of mine, I've written about, blogged about it a lot, and I spoke to you about it when we met as well, was the idea that you can experience quite a lot of different things through screens with a mute button on and not having to listen to anything. And so there's a kind of a laziness in. I always think Facebook's probably done one of the best jobs on untraining our ears in the last 20 years than anyone else, because you can just be on that app and look at stuff and
Yeah.
never put the volume up. And I know from my own behavior with that, which I feel like I'm on the beginning of with the light phone, of course, being
Yeah.
able to sort of I've got a different digital life this year than I've ever had before, and it's more intentional. But I think for me, when I was really gripped by apps, and a lot of this my age group, it's to do with control, and you have a kind of control all the time to be able to choose. I'll listen, or I'll watch, or I'll watch this bit with that bit, or I'll read. It's I can the control that you have over the media that is digital seems to be at the heart of why many of us are addicted to it. Might as well just say the word. What's that like with kids, under the age of 16 that you've seen, whether it's toddlers, 8, 9 year olds, early teens? Do you see um, that spark of, oh, I can control this?
Yes. Yeah. And it's what you were saying about mute. Children's listening skills have got worse, and it's something I have to work on more and more with them. Um, and yeah, we need to learn, as children, we need to learn to listen to people that we may not particularly be interested in. When teachers are talking, there's not every child is going to be interested in what the teacher's saying the whole time. Much as they'd love to, they can't mute their teacher. And it's such an important skill. I mean, I was listening to the podcast with your lovely Kate, talking about the importance of listening skills, um, in her role as a communication facilitator. And yeah, we need to help children to be better listeners, because that's how they're going to learn. And they are losing that skill.
Yeah. As a musician, it's a huge thing, because I think most of my generation grew up with natural ability and a norm to listen to a long piece of music, and that's got shorter and shorter and shorter over the
Yeah,
last
definitely.
30 years. And that's kind of why I made Super Connected, to begin with. That's how much it's meant to me, though, that we can sustain listening for as long as watching. And I'm not sure if there is a culture anymore where people will get together as a family. I might be wrong. I hope I am, but families get together and they do bond over television series, and they do bond over movies. I'm not sure if people get together and sit in the listening room, close their eyes with speakers and have dinner anymore. I'm pretty sure it was fairly rare in the old days as well, but I know a lot of people did used to do that, but it's gone, I think,
Yeah.
completely. I'm trying to do it now. I did it yesterday on my own. Just listened to two albums back to back that I'd never listened to before, and just gave it time. And it was a really healthy experience. But I was taught to do that when I was little. I
Yeah.
sit with my mum. She said, listen to this, and turn over the record,
Yeah, absolutely.
It was a really great way to understand that you couldn't get an experience of stimulation immediately all the time. You
Yes.
had to take time, and you had to have a little break in the middle of it. Uh,
Yeah.
and I guess those elements don't exist so much with smartphones because of regulation a lot of the time. I think the complaints that I hear about many of the amazing groups, Smartphone Free Childhood, Delay Smartphones, Screen Sense. There's so many groups now all over the world, but it's very focused on the fact that everything is coming through the smartphone at the same time. But if
Yes.
your brain has completed its sort of growth cycle when you're an adult, then that's up to you how you deal with. But for kids, it's I don't know how I would have coped with it, to be honest. It's
No.
wild.
And attention spans are terrible now. I would say in the under 16s because they've got these short TikTok videos or things on YouTube that are just a couple of minutes, and then they go to the next one and the next one and the next one. So they don't get the opportunity to watch longer, like we would watch a film or, you
Yeah.
know,
What do you feel about the idea that because you're training youngsters and children and really small children to use their eyes and their ears and their mouth to be able to communicate, you're actually training when you work, aren't you?
yes.
And what does it feel like when I say, which other people have said, I'm not the first one to say it, that TikTok is also training young kids?
Yeah, but in what way?
In the way that the algorithm can detect your reaction to what you're seeing on the screen in order to preload the next thing that you see on the screen, so that you're in this kind of constant loop of satisfaction because it learns what you like and what you don't like quite quickly. And that's training you. I mean, if for me, I can't. I've never had TikTok, and my experiences with it were like, it's too short
Yeah.
for me. I
Me
don't
too.
enjoy it. But if you're, 9, 8, 7, and I've heard kids as young as 4 in the UK are using TikTok, that's training you in a way to stay
Yeah.
within a frame of what your taste is. What's
Yeah, I would call it addiction and not training.
right? I mean, from the firm, from the company itself, the company to me looks like they're training underdeveloped minds to stay within a very limited field of digital experience.
Absolutely. And reducing real life experience, which is what all screens do.
Which puts you quite sort of firmly on one side of the ring, doesn't it?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Who's gonna I mean, now that you've kind of come together with Becky and Sanjeev and Safe Screen campaign as well, and I'm sure this health professionals for safer screens is going to grow a lot because it's needed, isn't it?
Oh, yeah.
Where does the help come from where you're standing? Where does it need to come? Is it national government? Is it the NHS? Is it the some kind of alliance with big tech? Who do you see as the most important ally at the moment to combat the issues that you're
Got to
dealing
start with the parents.
with? Mhm.
We've got to talk to parents about their own screen use, about screens being used around the house. So when they're not on the phone, the TV's on in the background, like I was talking about earlier, and explain to parents that by children watching them on their screens, that's habit forming for the child. So it's got to start with the parents. I can't see the tech companies doing much. I can't see the government putting in any really effective regulations. I mean, the Education Select Committee said that for young children, screens do more harm than good. That was great, but I don't know where that's going to go.
Mm.
Yeah, it's got to start with the parents, and we've, like I said to you earlier, we've got to be honest with parents about the harm that screens do and help them make the right choices and decisions.
Yeah. Um, yeah, what you say resonates hugely with me in terms of tech companies because, of course, I think it was this week anyway, Meta announced that they've now got teen accounts
Yeah,
where they've introduced some more restrictions around young people's signing up process for Instagram or Facebook. And but of course that's just normalizing it, isn't it?
yeah. I don't see how that's going to significantly cut down on their screen time.
Mm. Mm.
Um, and children are so tech savvy that they find their ways around these things, you know?
Yes, and I remember Douglas Rushkoff on this very podcast saying that they'd already done the kind of tests in America for parents who are worried that their children might get left behind by adopting tech later. They've done the experiment that kids who had technology from age 9 or 10 are actually less equipped by the time they were 16 to manage tech as kids who were like 15 or 16 when they were introduced to tech.
Yeah,
And because the brain is able to absorb quicker. I mean, I'm not an expert on this. You have to see what Douglas talked about with this, but
right.
yeah, I just want to say that because I have some friends who parents are concerned about their kids, and I always remind them of that it's like that you don't need to start kids off on you know
No,
technology for them to be better at it when they're older.
no, at
It's
all.
a natural bit of development, but it doesn't need to happen when you're like 8 or 9,
No.
does it? Um, and just on that, as we're talking about different ages as well, what I've noticed is more than anything with Super Connected is that until we got out and started doing the live shows, I was approached by many people who thought I was on a very extreme side with something, or like very anti-tech, or very, and because there's so many individual opinions about all of this, but actually it's much more complex. It's not, there's not a black and white approach that you can take with this because it's different for 3-year-olds, it's different for 8-year-olds, it's different for 13-year-olds, it's different for 16-year-olds, and it's different for all the parents of who have kids in those age groups, isn't it? It
Absolutely.
which is why the solution or the beginning of a solution to help um, young people have a more balanced future between embodied life and technological life. Is this idea that we have to act as a collective, don't we? We can't be kind of my kids are going to do this and their kids are going to do that. You've got to come together, haven't you?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And, kids don't want to be the only one who doesn't have a smartphone or doesn't have access to the internet.
Mm,
Um,
mm.
but if as a group, parents say, well, we're not going to give our children phones until this age, or a whole school said, well, we're not going to allow phones in school, that's the only way it's going to work.
Do you feel that it's some for some kids that have been introduced to social media, have been introduced to TikTok, are using smartphones who are in their early teens, that that's one area to look at because a lot of them, like the one in the film, they do have an addiction, but actually it's setting the norms for the younger children who don't even start that until much later. It's two distinct groups, that, isn't it?
Yes, yes, it is. Um,
When we're talking about this, and certainly I know when we're talking to the other members of the health professionals for safer screens, it feels like it's one issue, but it's not, is it?
no, and we're trying to break it down.
Yeah, it's
Uh,
hard.
yeah, it is. It is really hard. Yeah, and we're trying to give guidance for each age group. Um, and just to encourage parents to put it off for as long as possible, because it is harder to take screens away once they've been introduced.
Absolutely.
Um,
Yeah. And do you
is
not
there a,
think that it becomes sort of incumbent on the tech companies to realize just what a difficult job this is for parents? Would you just
uh,
that's just the absolute waste of time trying to lobby?
yeah, I don't, do they care? You know, isn't it just about money at the end of the day?
Mm,
They
mm,
could argue that they're making parents' life easier in some ways, couldn't they? If you haven't got time to read a story, then here's an app for story time.
yeah.
I'm not sure they care.
It does come down to the ones who do care, which is the parents. No parents want their kids to not be getting the best possible experience growing up, as a human being.
Absolutely.
Mm,
Parents are trying to do their best and they believe they're doing their best
mm,
because they believe what they're being told, but they're being misled.
mm,
And that's why, as a group, we're trying to be honest with
mm.
parents and give them the information they need.
I think it's amazing what you're doing, and certainly for me, because it's I don't know, like most creative people, we all work from an inner child point of view anyway. So, and childhood is
Yeah,
that's where we started making stuff, and those of us that carried on making stuff are the ones that to turn into artists, I suppose. But I love that you've got together to do this. And I don't think it's going to be easy, but I'm glad that we're all working together towards it. I don't know. I love I'm the first tech adopter of everything, and I love the idea of being able to go forward with a balance. It just feels
yeah,
it's completely out of balance at the moment.
yes, yeah, yeah. And I'm so grateful to Becky for starting the group and
Yeah.
gathering us all together.
It'll be an interesting road ahead with this.
Yeah,
And I keep thinking that we'll be looking back at these discussions at some point and go, wow, things have changed. And that's why I like documenting it, to be honest.
yeah,
Because you can forget when I didn't realize that 7 years ago. I didn't, well, I could sort of, pretend that I predicted all of it. Well, I didn't at all. I thought this was a really interesting one-off story about one person. And then now here we are.
yeah.
It's well, is there something else that you'd like to add? Because I think it's amazing hearing everything that you said, particularly about the lockdown, which I think for so many of us is such a surreal part of our lives. And I'm only just starting to hear other people's stories in, profession like you're in, and understanding just how much damage was done on so many different levels. But is there something that you something else you wanted to add?
Um, Only really, I think children are through screens still locked down in some way. This we've still they're still not getting enough social interaction, so screens are locking them down in a
Mm,
similar way to them being locked down. during COVID. And we need to help them out of that.
And I'm sure with the new group with you and Becky and Sanjeev and Safe Screens campaign, I think that's happening already. People are finding each other, and
Yeah. And we're gonna keep trying.
Yeah, no, I think that's my intention. Is that the idea that childhood gets taken over by all the same stuff that adulthood is taken over. It's like we can't have that. We've got to have that period to just to dream and just be kids. It's
Yeah.
and thank you for fueling that dream of mine. And I think so many other people.
Oh, well, thank you for supporting us and for giving us the opportunity to keep
We've
talking
only
about
just
it.
begun. We've only just begun.
Yeah.
Don't you wanna sing la 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 along with me? Well, don't you wanna sing